Hello, everyone. Uh, at the very beginning, I would like to apologize for a little delay with the invitations. We got an extremely overwhelming amount of interest in Chris Watson's talk today, and the mailbox was basically clogged. So you should have by now received your link. We are streaming our conversation on YouTube. Initially, we were planning a Zoom session, but precisely because of this huge interest, we decided to move to YouTube. So again, apologies for all the inconvenience, but here we are. And before introducing Chris Watson, which will be done by Tim Shaw, the other co-founder and co-curator of Walking Festival of Sound, I wanted to just very briefly tell you a few words about the festival, especially for those who are not familiar. The Walking Festival of Sound is a transdisciplinary initiative or event that explores the role of walking through and listening to our everyday surroundings. It combines a number of events in public spaces, obviously walks, sound walks, more or less technologically aided. We are interested in using this Walking Festival of Sound as a space, as a zone or a meeting point for an international network of practitioners and researchers for whom walking, listening, and space are the kind of crucial notions and crucial media that work with. And we like to kind of work with those aspects in a kind of expanded way. So far we organized two festivals, one in Stockholm in 2019, which was followed by second edition in Newcastle. And as mentioned, both events combine different kinds of walks, sound walks in different kinds of spaces, but also walking lectures, listening sessions, gatherings, also indoor initiatives such as the presentation of archival field recordings from the community. And currently, we are working on two editions, which were supposed to take place in 2020, but because of the pandemic, we were forced to shift them to 2021. And with the help from European Cultural Foundation, we'll be working with artists or soundwalkers in Krakow and in Edinburgh. And those two cities are so-called partner cities or sister cities. So we are trying to kind of reconnect or regenerate that kind of historical connection and see how we can work with listening also telematically, like between the two places. More information about these two events will be coming soon, and at the end of this talk I will post a little link to our website and Twitter where you will be able to find more information, and hopefully in March, beginning of March, there will be a program published. The events will take place online in April. So saying this, I would like to pass the microphone to Tim Shaw, who will introduce Chris.
Thank you, Jacek, for the introduction. And yeah, sorry everybody about the slight delay. We had a really overwhelming response to this talk, which is great. It shows us a really good and strong interest in this and also Chris's work. So I'm really excited about this conversation. So my name's Tim Shaw. I'm also curating the Walking Festival of Sound, and I would like to introduce Chris Watson. I'm sure many of you are aware of his work anyway, but as part of an introduction, I'll just give you a quick overview. Chris is a world-leading field recordist and artist working with environmental sound. Since at least the 1980s, Chris has worked and developed a distinct interest in recording wildlife sounds of animals and also the habitats that they inhabit, different places all around the world. Chris is a composer and sound recordist specializing in creating spatial sound installations which feature a strong sense and spirit of place. Chris has worked on numerous radio programs, installations, documentaries, and other collaborative endeavors. Chris's installations have been commissioned by galleries and festivals around the world, a list which is probably so extensive it would take the rest of the program to mention them all. So I would invite you to go to his website to see the impressive list of things that he's done. And you also have a a strong release, string of releases on the Touch Record label as well. So welcome, Chris. It's really a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yes, it's good to see you, and thank you to everyone for joining us. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you. I mean, we do have some history, don't we? We have some previous knowledge of each other's work, and we have worked together and been on field trips together. So yeah, I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you.
Great.
And also hearing from the audience as well. So I'm interested to hear what other people's thoughts are as well when we get around to that.
Yeah, there'll be a chance for people to ask questions towards the end, and also we'll do some more listening because I mean that's what we're all here for, right? Is to listen to stuff, and not just to listen to people speaking, but also other types of sounds. And I guess the first question I'd like to ask is in relationship to the sounds we just heard as people were coming on to the YouTube page and landing there. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on there, what people are listening to, and maybe the project that was related to more generally?
Yeah, it was very appropriate for the times we've been living in. This was actually a commission through a friend of mine, the poet Alec Finlay, who was based in Edinburgh. And Alec was not able to get out. He suffered quite badly with the virus in any case, and he's not able to get out much. And so he had a commission through a Scottish organisation called Paths for All, so which is a charity for people who are less able to get out and walk up onto the hills and mountains of Scotland. And one of Alex's ideas and what he asked me to do was create 2 sound walks in places which were difficult to access in the best of times and were virtually impossible for some of the people who the charity supports. And so I chose 2 of my favourite places up in Scotland. And what you just heard was the sound of a walk which I imagined around Forsinard in the Scottish Highlands, which is the famous flow country. So peat bogs, upland peat bogs, and acidic grasslands, a treeless landscape. And what's interesting about that place and the next location, which we'll hear from later, is that in springtime, certainly, you see very little because it's a very flat, waterlogged landscape. But you hear everything, and everything that's up there above the surface are birds. And because there are no trees, they have aerial displays, most of them. And so if you go very early, those recordings were made from 2 a.m. on a spring morning and move slowly around in the dark, then you get lots of birds, the snipe, curlew, the plovers, the skylarks displaying over you, so you get this remarkable umbrella of sound which sort of follows you around. I mean, I try with both of these pieces not actually to walk too much whilst I'm recording. I mean, I walk to the locations. That's the sort of paradox about some of these conversations. I'm usually stationary when I'm recording, or my microphones certainly are. And I made a whole series of surround recordings at various positions, which I plotted out on an Auden survey map as a credible walk to take. Because I'd recorded them in a surround sound format, I could then decode them binaurally, which is, if you're listening on headphones as we are now, to something like that is the ideal method. I don't use a lot of binaural recordings. I very rarely make binaural recordings, but for something like this, it was really appropriate to make a binaural diffusion to give people that sense of space, particularly if they were inside listening to the outside. I actually did that for both the pieces we're going to hear, but that first one was early spring. And the interesting thing is, of course, most of those sounds, the best part of that soundscape happens well before sunlight, sunrise, daybreak.
So it's an imagined journey that you're taking people
it was
on.
something. I mean, I had some conversations with Alec, and we talked about places, and I actually thought about doing something around Edinburgh because, as Jacek was saying, it's one of the partner cities with Krakow, and it's a fantastic place for sound because of the acoustics of those narrow streets and the environment. And so I did actually at one point think about an urban piece, but then I thought, people just want to be outside and somewhere wild, and that's about as wild as it gets in the Highlands of Scotland.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so it's kind of an approach to sound walking, which is quite different to the traditional approach. I mean, the traditional approach is you meet people in a place and you go on a walk together, and it's kind of a group listening activity, and there's a sort of an awareness of the sound and attention to the environment that the group sort of are encouraged to engage with during the walk. And this piece is kind of, it's more of the other way around. It's more stationary moments that you've taken with this Soundfeel microphone, and then you're taking the listener on this.
Yeah, I mean, I rarely, like I said, I rarely record when I'm walking. I do sound walks. I mean, we've done them. We did when we were in Aulus Liban, where we walked around the village. But when I do that, and I do make a point of doing it because I just simply enjoy doing that. It's really good to have the freedom of not carrying kilos of equipment on your shoulders and no headphones on, and just walk around and listen to the space. And I do that a lot, so I knew before I went up to Fort Synod, I knew the place. And I got some locations marked with a GPS. So, I didn't have to do any research. I mean, that's how I normally regard sound walks, as research, although I do them for sort of pleasure. At the moment, on our daily walks around urban parts of Newcastle, I'm listening out for what's happening. And I take a lot of pleasure in doing that. It's very satisfying. It's also really satisfying not to have to record it as well for a change, and just enjoy it.
The pressure of the recording, and also, I guess, enjoying the process without there having to be a product at the end.
Yeah,
such as the recording.
And plus it's immediate. Then it's transient as well. So I like that. It's the moment's gone. It's just you retain it in your memory, which we have a very good memory for sound, and I enjoy the moment in that aspect without having to think I need to come back and record this. So I do value that process.
Yeah, but you said you did it like kind of solo as a sort of personal endeavor. But you also do it. I mean, we've also been on sound walks together with the AV Festival, the one on Embleton Beach, and also in the Exhibition Park in Newcastle, where we did the Dawn Chorus Walk. So you're also inviting audiences into this process as well sometimes, and that's interesting. And I also, because you present your work in lots of different ways, through installations, through radio, through documentaries, through CD releases. But sound walking is also a way you present your work, and I was wondering kind of what do you find different about that kind of presentation of work to maybe other forms of presentation?
Well, it's live for a start. You're with people, you're with a group of people, and you're right. I mean, quite often with part of commissions, part of the deal is take people out, and that's a bit. It's a bit like sort of a show and tell. So when we were in Aulus or Newcastle in Exhibition Park, I had recording equipment with me, and we went at 4 a.m, didn't we? Because we went at the time when I would ordinarily record, and I did that. I did part of that to really demonstrate what I do when I'm out there, because it's still, I know we're all sort of talking, I would imagine all of us in this conversation have a good idea of what we do, not necessarily particularly, but when we're out recording, but to a public who are interested in sound and want to be engaged by it, they've sometimes no idea what you're doing, or how the process works. So that when I do those pieces, it's a bit like that. We go out, not necessarily with the aim of making very good or particular recordings, but really just to demonstrate what happens and what it sounds like. But, a bit like some of your work. So I take a back detector, an ultrasonic detector with me, or I take some contact microphones and demonstrate the techniques that we all use on location, and just have a little speaker sometimes to explain what I'm doing. It's interesting that this sort of school of thought, because with my sound walks, it's not this silent exercise. It's not an Anne-Marie Schaefer Vancouver style sound walk where nobody talks, nobody smiles. It's a serious business, and so you start at point A, go to point B, and nobody says anything. You listen, and that's fine. But it's life's a bit too short for me for that. So I quite often explain at the start that I will be pointing out to some people the blindingly obvious and the sounds and the acoustics of the environment. And people, it seems to work, the feedback I've had from that. So that's the style of it. There's communication within it, there's talking within it, which, I appreciate some people might not want to do.
Yeah, I think it's definitely removed from that tradition. But there's also you talking about the sounds, which helps frame it in a particular way, I think. Like, I can remember when we were doing the sound walk on Embleton Bay, for example, and we moved between, a soundscape where everything was quite distant and you were hearing kind of a general, like undefined soundscape, into more kind of detailed environments where there were more things going on. And you framed that as a, like, through language, through talking, basically. Like, you allowed people into kind of what would be usually going on in your head when you're making recordings or choosing a location to make a recording, you kind of shared. And that's interesting to me. Like, I think there's not many opportunities in field recording to share the process, actually.
No.
That's something that's, like, usually that's all hidden away from the audience. When you go to an installation, you don't really have, or an installation or a recording or listen to a radio program or whatever, you don't really have access to that process that goes on behind the recording. All of those mistakes, all of those things that you didn't do, all of those times you didn't press record or whatever, and that's, I think, interesting about these sound walks. And, or like, that's, to me, what's interesting is that it reveals some of the process that goes on behind these practices.
That's interesting you say that, because I'm just been talking to a producer and a radio producer at the BBC about doing that, making a program about a sort of behind the scenes sound piece, but on location, which would be quite an interesting take. I mean, I do sometimes, because it is a solitary activity, and I enjoy that. I really relish being out there on my own, and because when you put headphones on and you listen through microphones or hydrophones or whatever, no one else can hear the world like that. It's a unique, solitary experience, and I relish that. I enjoy it. But I also like the other side, which is what we're doing now, where you can present some work to an audience and play it back, and in this case, sort of set the context. I really value that, coming out the other side of, coming out of a loudspeaker, if you like, from entering through a microphone, because that's not possible with a lot of the mediums that I work in. Television, you don't do that. You don't explain halfway through a soundtrack how you made the recording, or what's happening. If you get the chance through the endless scores of orchestral music. Anyway, let's not talk about that. So yeah, that process is interesting, and it's part of it. I was just doing something about this the other day. Because it's not a cold calculated thing. I have to feel that I'm in the right place when I make recordings, and so having to talk about that is interesting as well. How you feel about sound and how you articulate it, because our language is so poor as regards sound. Let's see what that sounds like and things like that.
Yeah, sure. And also maybe it's not useful always to have people present with you when you're making those decisions, because they're really based on intuition, or like you've spoken before in the past about this idea of having an awareness of space that's very difficult to articulate, like the sense of place. You've talked about it in relationship to, and that's maybe very difficult to share because it's really a very individual experience that isn't helpful to invite people into, or it would just be you standing quietly in a field, maybe. It would be difficult to share in a kind of meaningful way, maybe.
Yeah, staring into space. Although that part of it for me started with walking. When I first came up to Northumberland in the early sort of mid 1980s, and I started to explore this landscape for sound, I just took an ordinary Ordnance Survey map because I didn't know Northumberland at all, and use that as my reference. The patterns and the key on the map, and go to some of those places. But then I also discovered some of the place names that were on the map as well, and they were based on sound. So places where traditionally they had a black grouse lake would be, Black Grouse Edge or Cock Law or something like that, which indicated the presence of black grouse. And the same with the human element, with the Border Reivers, so I went to these romantic or fanciful sounding places like Hangman's Rock, Murder Clough, Bloody Bush, which were now peaceful, tranquil environments because the Forestry Commission had been planted since. But in the 17th and 18th century, it was the realm of the Border Reivers, and it was a very different, violent, bloody landscape, which would have had a very different soundtrack to it. And then having a forest planted over the top of it, I was interested to know if anything could be revealed from underneath, because I was, at the time, certainly in the 80s, I was very interested. I was reading Thomas Lethbridge's work. Thomas Lethbridge was the director of the Museums of Antiquity at Cambridge University. And he was the person that really got me interested in this sense and spirit of place, because he articulated it very well and described some of his walks and his expeditions to places like Skellig Michael or up into the Arctic, and this presence felt in places. And I think, we can all experience that, even certainly in urban environments. We all know, you can walk into a house or a room or a building and sense something which is hard to describe. But part of that, so it can be good or bad. People say this place has an atmosphere, and I'm sure part of that is conveyed by the acoustics of those spaces. So when I made my first album for Touch, Stepping into the Dark, it was about walking into those places, particularly up in Kielder, and the experience that I felt being there. And then being able to travel through working with the BBC Natural History Unit, I was then escorted off to these remarkable places in the Masai Mara in Kenya and Venezuela, into the rainforest, and worked with people locally and discovered they have, even in completely different cultures, exactly the same experience as we do when they walk into places. They can sense that spirit of place. It's so powerful.
That's very interesting, and I think it's also related to a question that I had for you about so we can understand kind of sound walking, however we want to define that. We can understand a version of it through the kind of Vancouver History Soundscape Project research, and that has a very particular characteristic generally, including staying silent and moving between places, and not necessarily smiling. And I think Jacek and I, through this festival, we're interested in that tradition for sure, but also in other traditions, and thinking about how sound walking might occur in other places, and how other people who might not even call it sound walking might engage with the sound walking practice. And I wonder, like, with the kind of multiple travels that you've done, have you ever encountered people who kind of do this anyway, do have a sound walking practice or an engagement with environment that's similar to yours, or that is more like aware of the primary sense of sound.
Without a doubt. I mean, the Maasai, who in Kenya, in East Africa, where sound and listening whilst they're walking to them is a matter of life and death, because they're walking among spotted hyenas and leopards and lions and buffalo and hippos at night. So they need to listen, and we've lost that ability now. It's not important to us unless we're crossing the road. That's, we maybe listen then, but it's not vital to our survival, as it still is to people like the Maasai or Namib tribespeople, who are sort of still, in some respects at the sort of hunter-gatherer stage. But I learned a lot from Francis, a Maasai I've known for 20 years, on just listening to places. And in fact, when I first met him, which was the end of the 1980s, early 90s, I was really privileged because he was my guide for a field trip. I was working on a feature film soundtrack, so I was working on my own with a storyboard, but I was with Francis. And so because I was ignorant of the place and the potential dangers of being out there, and where the good places or the bad places might be. And so I listened and watched Francis, and I tried to ask him, without giving me leading questions, if there were special places for him, where he would go with the family for effectively a Sunday afternoon. And there were the special curves in the River Mara, not where the hippos haul out, but places where it was just a pleasant place to hang out. And part of that was how it sounded. The steep red curves of the banks of the Mara reflected sound back. And so it gave you just a really good sense of space and place to be. Whereas if you go out to the croton thickets, where some of the predators might be, even I, at a very early stage, realized this isn't a good place to hang out, because you can't see what's the other side of the bushes or what's in the ditch, and it might well be a pride of lions. So I started to be able to tune in, and then Francis was helping me record, and so I learned just by listening to him on how he would interact with that landscape.
And what was that? Was that landscape very, very complex sonically, or not?
Yes, massively. Yeah, it varies from riverine woodland around the River Mara, where you really don't spend much time because lots of things can hide in there. You don't go down to the riverbanks. It's full of Nile crocodiles, which will take something like a zebra or a wildebeest, something 2 or 3 times my body weight, off the riverbank and drag it into the river very quickly. And so a lot of the time we're in vehicles. There are a few places where it's, with Francis, it was safe to get out and walk, including one. I remember I went out at night with him. We went to do some recording, and we couldn't get the vehicle through this place where we'd been recording hyenas, and we left the car, and it was getting dark, and we needed to go and get these microphones back. And we went about 20 yards. He says, "Oh, hang on, Chris, I've got to go back." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I've forgotten my spear." I thought, Christ, what good's that going to do us if we get set upon in the darkness? And he had his spear and his arungu, his olive root throwing club. And he felt a lot happier, but I was less confident.
Hopefully you'd never have to use it.
Oh, well, I couldn't, but he could. It was amazing with his arungu, yeah.
Wow, yeah. Well, that's really interesting and fascinating. I think sound walking is, to these people, is such an everyday thing. Like for us, it's kind of it's something different. And
what was interesting there, to interrupt, and what something that I do here, from a sound point of view, are night walks, which are incredibly revealing. I mean, out there it was a different thing, because the animals at night use the acoustics of that landscape very well. So hyenas howl, but they don't howl like wolves by throwing their heads back. They howl into the ground and use the baked red earth of the Masai Mara as a sounding board, so they can communicate over miles. What I really enjoy here in the safety of a deciduous woodland in northeast England is going for a walk along the banks of the River Coquet at night, because you're forced then to listen more carefully. There's actually a really good book by a fisherman called Chris Yates called Night Walks, which I'd recommend to everybody. And that, in fact, that's what got me into it, listening to some of his broadcasts and reading his book, and realizing that, because when we're out at night, walking and listening take on a much more acute perspective.
Yeah, the sort of sensory deprivation of the visual enhances the sonic for sure. And I mean, yeah, it's interesting, kind of, we've been told by governments to socially isolate and to limit who we see and to spend time on our own. And as field recordists, we've been doing that.
It's perfect.
We're kind of used to that now. Yeah.
I really enjoy it. Being told I have to avoid everybody.
So I know everybody's sick of COVID, but I was going to ask a question that's related to something you said recently on promotional material I saw for Sound of the Year Awards. And you said, we all began to listen more during 2020. Locally, we heard and were inspired by birdsong in parks and gardens. Nationally, we listened to environments and each other as the background noise of cities, motorways, and the skies were dimmed. So why do you think listening and maybe sound walking or an engagement with sound has become more important during the kind of COVID, post-COVID or COVID times that we live within?
I think that's a really good question, Tim, and there's lots of answers that I could give. I mean, first of all, whenever it was in March last year, the skies emptied, traffic stopped, cities ground to a halt, and all of a sudden that patina of anthropogenic noise disappeared. So, we could all hear things. And I think then people started to rediscover what I was talking about earlier, what's been lost. And so there's a lot of the time, particularly in urban environments, we hear everything, but we don't listen because we can't listen through the noise. And so that's why, my theory is, so many people walk around with earbuds in and listening to music. It's not to listen to music in a particularly bad acoustic, it's to block out all the noise that we have to put up with. When that was taken away, without being told or without being explained to them, people started to listen. I had radio producers from the Guardian who have done podcasts for just rang me up and said, "Chris, it's amazing. I live in Chiswick and there's all this bird song in my street and the birds are singing really loudly." And I'm sure they weren't singing much more loudly. They might be more vigorously, but it's just that they heard it for the first time. And it was great because they had this sort of childlike approach. They were just in awe of what they could hear all of a sudden. And so people then, when they were out on their prescribed walks in parks and gardens, and again, this is very particular, I think, to most of the population who live in urban environments, people all of a sudden could hear what was happening around them and started to take notice. The thing that I was interested in was I also realized quite quickly that the animals' behavior changed as well, because in our suburban back garden here in Newcastle, the blackbird, which was singing from 4 o'clock in the morning, seemed to have a really vigorous, powerful song. And maybe I noticed that because of the lack of noise from Newcastle Airport and the A1, which is a couple of miles away. But I think perhaps one of the reasons was because the blackbird in our garden all of a sudden could hear the blackbird in number 47 and the blackbird in number 16 down the road, and suddenly thought, perhaps, this is anthropomorphic guessing, thought, Christ, I can all of a sudden, I can hear this rival male down the road and another one over there. And there's another one over there, which I've never heard before because of the pattern of noise. And the significance of that which I think is revealed this year by the plethora of blackbirds, we sometimes get 8 in our back garden, is that the females could also hear all these rival males, and the females were quite likely to think, actually, I know I've sort of mated with this male here and we've got a nest, but I quite like the song from number 23 and the one from number 12. So I'm going to go and mate with him and increase my gene pool and have a clutch of eggs that's fathered by 3 or 4 males instead of 1. And this year we've got this fantastic harvest bonus of blackbirds because they've had such a good season. And I think it's starting again. So it's just that sense of being able to listen in space and without being interrupted. And very quickly, the animals adapted within weeks. Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And that was evidenced even in places like the St. Lawrence Seaway with belugas all of a sudden turning up in places around Tassadake where they'd not been able to hear each other before. And that movement, that sense across a space where there was no noise pollution. It's a bit off topic, but it was interesting to me anyway at the time.
No, it's totally on topic. It's a productive year for blackbirds. I'm glad to hear it. I mean, they're usually quite good at adapting to urban environments, aren't they, blackbirds? But now they must feel very emancipated.
All those birds have. They're super smart, starlings, blackbirds, robins. These are woodland edge birds that have moved into towns and cities to take advantage, of the waste that we produce in terms of food and the habitats that we provide, particularly in sort of urban gardens and parks. And we can hear them, and they're starting now. I would encourage everybody in these sort of latitudes that just to get out, early and late and just listen to those spaces because they're astonishingly revealing and very sound rich environments, because we've got more traffic than we had, but it's still nowhere near as bad as it was pre-COVID.
Especially air traffic at the moment. There's not many flights going in and out of Newcastle, for example. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I guess that is a relief. So I'm aware we're quite pushed for time, and I'd like to also open up some questions for other people. So I'll ask one more question, and then maybe we'll listen to something for a few minutes, and then maybe we'll open up. Jacek maybe has a question, and then we can open up to other people.
Okay.
I wanted to ask. I mean, this is actually a question about technology, and I don't want to ask too much about it, but it's because I think we can descend into gear talk, and I don't think that's useful for anyone. Or maybe it is, but I don't want it to go that direction. But we've been on a lot of field trips together, and and a lot of your equipment is orientated around a kind of static recording position. So you go to somewhere and you choose a particular location you set up, and you leave it for sometimes very long periods of time. And I'm wondering whether you've ever experimented with more of a portable setup, or whether I guess with TV work, maybe you've had to do boom stuff and walk around more. Is this something that interests you, or are you very happy for the static? Are you more aesthetically drawn to having a static setup?
Yeah, I am, is the short answer. But I do. I mean, the only way that I've been able to achieve anything by moving and recording is binaurally. And I like that, as a very personal device, then I love it. And I do that. I sometimes wear my DPA 4060s on my headphones, and I don't plug my headphones in. And I just, or on the side of a hat or something like that. And I enjoy that. And I just use it solely for my own listening pleasure. Actually, my grandson, Freddie, who's 6, I bought him for his birthday one of those little Zoom VR things, which incredibly has an A format microphone array in it and a binaural facility as well. So I go for walks, or did, on the beach up in Edinburgh with Freddie, and we'd record and listen to the sea and listen to the seagulls, and then he could take that back and play it back in the evening. And he used it as sort of bedtime storage because he could relive the walk. He could relive the event binaurally. And without having to, I mean, the technology meant nothing to him, but that transparency of listening back to a binaural recording was, it was a real pleasure for me to see how he was really drawn to it. So I like that as a technique, but because we have an interest in spatial sound, what you can't really do with that is move the microphone array, because it immediately displaces you. Binaural works like that, so you're encouraged to move around, and that's what I enjoy about it. But with a spatial aspect like B format or WMS, what you use, you can't really move, So if I want to do that, I change perspectives by moving the microphone and listening.
And then do things in post-production to draw between those 2 points.
Yeah,
for example.
yeah, if it's appropriate. Yeah. I mean, I did that actually in a very different place, in a very different walk. I did that when I worked with Hilda and Sam on the Chernobyl soundtrack, when we were in this partly decommissioned nuclear reactor in Lithuania. We transitioned between environments. Hilda was quite interested in that change from one to the other. And so we did a few of those, because those spaces were so huge and so coloured sound-wise, that there was dramatic differences. And so we did a bit of that. I just had a stereo array on a pole for that. And the movement was part of it. The distortion of perspective was something that she was interested in working with.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Freddie's very lucky to have Chris Watson as his grandfather. He's a budding sound artist in the making. Either that or he'll rebel and not ever touch the microphone ever again. Okay, I think we should listen to another recording and then open the floor. So maybe we play a few minutes of this. I'll turn my camera and microphone off.
Is this the summertime?
This is the summertime one, I believe. Yeah.
So the Caledonian forest in the Cairngorms.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll cut my mic as well.
Great. Some amazing sounds though.
That was mostly that was from the that was another walk for the Paths for All, and that was a sort of an early morning walk through the Caledonian pine forest, the great wood of Caledon in the Cairngorms, where again most of that sound was recorded during the darkness, and the repetitive close-up sounds of capercaillie. In Gaelic, it's called the horse of the woods, which will follow you around. So it was, that wasn't sort of in one place. The males get so sort of pumped up that time of year. They see people as intruders, and the microphones in particular, and it will follow you through the forest. And the flutter jumps produce this remarkable infrasonic pulsing, which they'll come and strike you with their feathers. They're sort of almost turkey-sized birds with that remarkable champagne popping cork sound.
Yeah, it's an incredible sound. Yeah, I'll pass you now to Jacek. I think he has a couple of questions.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. And I mean, I have a whole list of questions myself, and I see there are a lot of questions already popping up on YouTube. But I just wanted, I mean, since we are in the kind of avian territory of birds, I would like to return to this blackbirds that you mentioned. I remember reading recently somewhere that, because of our contemporary architecture being very much based on this idea of copy-paste, very, simple prefabs that are very repetitive, birds are becoming very disoriented in spaces. And I've been thinking how much more important these days sound marks are in relationship to those birds than landmarks. I mean, when landmarks become repetitive, the sound marks are their kind of navigational, perhaps major navigational elements. What do you think about that?
I think it's a good point. I mean, they certainly use the acoustic properties of some buildings to, and again, particularly we're coming up to the time of year where it's important to them, because from now, this weekend, or last weekend rather, was the first blackbird song I heard, 5 o'clock in the morning. So they're starting to sing. And the males, it's mostly the males that sing, not exclusively. They use the acoustics of their environment to amplify their message because they can broadcast it further. So it's the equivalent of spotted hyenas using the hard-baked earth in the Masai Mara. Blackbird, a song thrush, missel thrush, will use prominent positions on the corners of buildings. And I've seen them respond to reverberation in that way. Confusingly, I've also seen or heard birds like robins respond to a slapback echo as if it's a rival male. And that's really confused them because they're responding aggressively to a sound that's coming back, a proper echo, not a reverberation. And so they're mistaking that for a potential rival. So they'll sing more they'll sing more vigorously against that. The biggest problem in urban environments has been noise, traffic noise, because most birds can't just sing louder to order. So some birds, there was an interesting paper written by Hans Schlaberkorn in the Netherlands a few years ago about how some birds, like great tits in particular, they can't sing louder to get through traffic noise, but they've raised the pitch of their song to try and cut through urban noise. And interestingly, at the end of the scale, Chris Clark, who was at Cornell in the States, discovered that northern right whales had increased the pitch of their songs off the coast of Maine to try and overcome shipping noise, and failed. And as a result, they'd had to move to much more less favorable breeding grounds. So shipping noise, had caused them to move, as well as sort of stressing them out. And I think you're probably right with the uniform build in a lot of places. Certainly Hans Schlaberkorn suggested that in the future, European cities will have a singular soundtrack, because birds who can't adapt to get through noise or the coloration caused by those buildings won't survive. in towns and cities anyway.
It's very, very fascinating. In Canada, there's this sparrow that apparently has recently dropped 2 notes in its song, and scientists don't really know why. And I think one suspicion is that it's the pace of reaction, and pace of life of those species. They have to basically shorten their songs in order to be able to cope with the with the stress, maybe more stressful life. I think I have one more question, very quick. I would like to ask. I'm sorry, but I cannot resist asking you, since you already touched upon it at some point, which is about the revealing of the technology behind the field recording practice. And I've been thinking about kind of the positive aspects of it and the downsides. And thinking about the downsides, I'm wondering about do you think that by showing all the technological complexity that resides somewhere, behind the scene, one can actually discourage people from engaging with field recordings, as opposed to, convince them? I mean, I know cases. I work with students, and I know that sometimes when they see all this, technological devices that are involved in the production of high quality field recordings, they feel like it's not the field for them, precisely because of this inaccessibility. And of course, I mean, there's a whole kind of other school of do-it-yourself tradition, or people and educators advocating using just very basic technologies, whatever off the shelf, the cheapest ones. I wonder what your position is in that respect.
Well, I think it's probably evolved. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm astonished what you can achieve on an iPhone, sound-wise. I mean, I've done voiceovers for radio programs. I've made recordings and sent them. So I think it works really well. But there's in the end, certainly people that I know who have done workshops, they come to the end stage of that and then want to explore further. They realize that in order to achieve a different perspective, literally, you don't need to stand there holding something. At the very least, wedge it in a tree and walk away, which is exactly the technique I've been using for a long time, but putting microphones there and running long cables back. And so as people get used to, photography and filmmaking, it's like the same. There's a really good route in through lo-fi recording, but in the end, then people just want more out of it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And the same with building your own kit. I used to do that. And then I've sort of just refined it to what works for me. So I think, it's very democratic in that sense. It's open to everybody and everything from, 6-year-old Freddie with a recorder to somebody with an iPhone to somebody with, 20,000 euros worth of equipment. The end result can be really good, irrespective of the technique. It's really down to how it's presented in that sense, I think.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, we can move on to the questions from the audience, and we have one from Rob Goldman. Is there anything that you can do about overtly obtrusive music, obscuring natural sound in natural history TV and film productions? I think it connects very nicely also to one of the recent interviews with Hildegard Westerkamp, who's been also kind of pointing out that problem.
It's just dreadful, isn't it? I mean, I've sort of given up. Producers, the people who make these programs, they're not all like this, but it's very easy to do that, to smear something in music. It's not necessarily any cheaper, because if you're employing the Vienna Philharmonic to play something, I just don't like it personally. But I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? But it's also, I cannot even sit down now and listen. Sometimes in places with lots of my own work in, I cannot sit down and listen and watch something that's just wallpapered with the most dreadful, inappropriate, characterless music, or where you're led by the nose to feel a certain way, to think a certain way. I just don't like it. I can't stand it. So I just don't watch those programs. And I've sort of given up. I mean, some producers who will still work with me call me up and ask me to work on their programs because of what I've brought to stuff in the past. Others just think, there's lots of reasons why, that's what's gone before. The other thing, unfortunately, is in television in particular, there's this culture of short-term freelance contracts. This is a wider topic. So young people in particular, were brought in on big major league film productions. The thing they want to do is get another contract and get another 3-month or 6-month contract. So what they want to do is not make a mistake. They don't want to try anything new because that's not what the last person did, or if the last person did it and they didn't get a contract. So there's a threat of that behind some people. Some of the older producers I work with, and I know one of them's listening now, is very good at steering her work uniquely almost. And because of that, makes standout programs, which people have wanted to emulate, programs without music, and which can be very successful. Years and years ago, I worked on a series with David Attenborough called The Life of Birds, and one of the programs was called something like Songs and Signals. And I remember it was full of bird song and sounds, and there was very, very little music in it. And I worked on it along with some other people. Anyway, it won a BAFTA for Best Factual Sound. And afterwards, one of the judges said to me they didn't notice there was no music in it because the soundtrack sort of filled the screen and the loudspeakers. So it's quite possible to be done. It needs people with rather more wit and imagination. It also needs people with something longer than a 3-second attention span, so they can bear to look and listen to a shot that doesn't change every few milliseconds. We think we should change the subject, because it's
I agree.
Go on about this forever.
I agree. I feel like a lot of those natural history TV or film productions really make you long for silent cinema period, I think. But Tim Archer has an interesting question about surround recordings. Are you using a multi-mic setup or a single ambisonic microphone?
I use both. I mean, I've got a Soundfield ST450, which is a B format microphone, which I use for all my installations because of the 360 spatial element with height and depth. Most of the time for television and radio for the last 10, 12 years, I've been using a Schoeps double mid-side array, which I can decode into any sort of broadcast format or keep as surround. And it's also compatible with B format because a double mid-side microphone, for the technically minded, is basically a Soundfield microphone without height. So the two mix together very well when I'm doing my installation pieces. But I will also use a quad array of hydrophones for some underwater surround as well. And I've worked with Tony Meyer, who's a professor of sound at the University of Surrey, runs the sound workshop. And Tony, with some of his students, built a B format hydrophone array with 12 hydrophones in it into this large sort of basketball shape, which was incredible. But it was sort of an experimental setup.
Great. There is a question from Joseph Young, and it's one of these very big questions. Can you say something about subjectivity and objectivity in your practice? Do you feel you put yourself into your recordings?
Yes, of course I do. Yeah, because I wouldn't bother recording them if I was, because I need to feel that it's talking about what I was saying earlier about the spirit of place. I need to, if I want people to react and get the similar impression or feeling or sensation that I felt when I was on location, then I have to get that when I'm there. And that's what I try and convey in a lot of my work. So I listen very carefully for that, and I have to feel happy about that before I press record. And that's one of the things that I hope transmits through all the process, the post-production process, the reproduction process. And I think it's possible, and I like to try and achieve that. So yes, even though I'm not around the microphones, I might be couple of 100 meters away, but I'm present within the recording, moving somewhere.
Yeah. There are some more questions. Someone is asking about attention, and maybe I'll kind of try to sneak in my question here, which is I often see this kind of dichotomy when it comes to talking about sound walking. Some people would talk about sound walking as something that allows you to develop deeper attentive span, or deeper attachment in terms of your attention towards the surrounding, and some other people would talk about sound walking as a possibility to develop like a surface attention, where you expose yourself to the multiplicity of sensory information around you, and I wonder about that. And to follow up the question that Kat Austin is asking here is if you see any possibilities that exist out there that would help challenge the trend of this short attention spans, like 3-minute attention spans.
Well, that's something that's very close to me. That idea of short attention spans and how, and it's, I mean, again, some other positive fallout from COVID has most likely been that people's attention spans have increased because we're not so distracted. And there are, I think that's evidenced by some of my installation work. I'm being asked to make longer and longer pieces, or people are happy to have longer pieces of work, and providing it's presented properly, people will go with it. There's been other developments. I mean, it's painfully slow at times. Been other developments. I've done a whole series of soundscapes for radio on the World Service, where it was much longer recordings that were sort of segued and shut in, and longer transitions. Famously, all the slow television that came out of Norway, which was mimicked by what BBC programs, worked really well. The knitting circle and the log fire and the train journey from Bergen to Oslo and the ferry journey up the coast. So if people are given the opportunity, they will go with it. And that's, and I'm working away from conventional broadcast mediums, I think opens the opportunity for that, in the same way that it does with spatial sound, because for me that goes with it. Longer attention spans, longer, more durational works, but more immersive, to use that overused term, by from what I'm interested in doing, is putting people where my microphones were when I made the recording, and then shutting up everything else and just letting people listen with, and hopefully engaging with the space. So I'm really interested in that at the moment, and I can see a change. I'm optimistic about that side of things. I've forgotten what the earlier part of the question was.
I think you covered it. It was about techniques of challenging or tackling this short span culture. Okay. Short attention span.
I've got such a short attention span, I forgot the first part of the question.
Oh yeah, the first part was about this different kinds of sound walking. One which is oriented more towards developing like a deeper connection with the space, and the other one which is more about letting yourself to be disrupted by the by the amount of signals and information.
But there's room for all of that.
Yeah.
It's not one or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not Vancouver's soundscape style, and it's not everybody having a conversation. It's incredibly varied. Christina Kubish's incredible electromagnetic walks through, which I ask everybody to check out. I think the one she did in Manchester is still online. That was on Radio 3. Astonishing electromagnetic sound walks, incredible places that were revealed out of the ordinary.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. I think Tim has one more question from the audience, and I guess we will be soon closing our conversation. Tim, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks very much. Yeah, let's just do one more question and then call it a day. Thank you, Chris. There's just one more from Jenny Soap. I think I'm pronouncing it right. She asked about hearing the robin responding to echo, and how important then is your eyesight in identifying such a situation, or can you tell this kind of change in sonic phenomenon just through listening, or do you also have to see?
No, you don't. No, I mean, I identified that bit of behaviour by hearing it, because I could hear it. I could hear this, because we were in the built environment, I could hear this strange slapback echo. So the distance between where the bird was singing and the building was obviously just right to produce this millisecond delay or whatever it was. And the robin responded. The robin thought that it was being challenged. And I don't think, I mean, this is my view on it. I don't know what the robin could see. I don't know what robin's eyesight is like. It's probably much better than mine. Big black eyes that can see in the dark. But I'm sure initially it was responding to the delay and to the acoustics of that environment. Line of sight was, I imagine, not necessarily that important. With robins, it's a relatively close range. The red robin redbreast, it's that challenging red flag signal, but that's a guess when they're in much closer proximity.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us and for giving us the time and fascinating conversation. I think we'll leave now with, unless you have anything more to say, we'll leave now with some more recordings and people can listen to those for a few more minutes. But I just want to say thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, and I look forward to recording again once you're allowed to meet other people.
No, thank you for everybody for tuning in, for joining. It's always good to have these conversations because, like I said earlier, much of what we do is a solitary activity. So it's good just to hang out and have a conversation about it.
Especially at the moment when we are so fragmented and it's going to be difficult to go back to normality. But thank you so much. Yeah, whatever that is. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Tim. I will just show you this little slide here with where you can find more information about our activities. So you see the link to the website and more information about the upcoming program for the festival. You will be always able to find on the Twitter. And saying that, I think now we can officially shut up, as Chris mentioned, and try to take the position of his microphones and listen to the piece that we started our talk today. Thank you again.